Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you. Welcome to the Elders Podcast, a podcast that discusses social development and international development aid and how its impacts on Africa, in Kenya, and around the world. Looking at having conversations with people who've been in the sector for a long time, who will share their experiences and their life stories and the impact that working in the sector has had on their lives. So, welcome. Today we have Ezra Mbogori, an elder in the sector, who's been working in the sector for 40 years and above, I think. Has worked in numerous organizations, both at Kenya level, continental level, and international level. And he's here to talk about his life story in the sector, but also to help us to unpack the journey of the sector, particularly the legislative journey from the NGO Coordination Act all the way to the Public Benefit Organizations Act, and looking at philanthropy and the tension between grassroots organizations and international organizations. So welcome Ezra to the podcast. As always, it's always great to have this conversation with you. Maybe you can just tell us a bit about yourself, how your journey into the sector, particularly the things that your life experiences that made you feel passionate to join the sector and stay in the sector for as long as you did.
Yeah, my life in the NGO sector started with finishing my degree at Kenyatta University. And I was very fortunate in that, having done as soon as I finished my exam, I got an internship with the World Council of Churches. And that gave me a ticket to Geneva. And for the next 9 months, I was attached to the World Council of Churches Urban Rural Mission Office. And that basically exposed me to the whole range of realities around poverty and people living in poor circumstances in urban and rural situations. And that's really what got me interested in both development work, but also in addressing issues of poverty.
Yeah, interesting. You were just speaking earlier, and you're telling me about your experiences in student leadership at Kenyatta University, and just how it influenced maybe your outlook towards life and I guess social justice,
Yes,
and human rights.
Yeah. In terms of student life, I was peripherally involved in student leadership. And while there, I took an interest, for instance, in drama. And because I was a science student, my subjects were actually physics and maths. And because I was focused on that, I also developed an interest in drama. And so I would be at the literature faculty and join other students who were involved in drama some of the time, and then go back to the classes where we had our maths and physics classes, and I always used to gravitate between the two. People thought that I was more interested in the girls at the literature halls, so that must be why I wasn't spending time in physics and math, but it was more the drama that had me captivated. So there was that interest in itself. But besides the student leadership, I was also very concerned about, or rather, in addition to the interest in drama, I was, because I'm the son of a preacher man, there was also this interest to support the church as well. Now, my dad was head of his church at the time, and while I was a student, and so I would go and join them at church in Lavington sometimes. And when I went there, there was a drama group called Lavington Players. So I started to play between Lavington Players and the drama association at college in Kenyatta University. Now, because I was getting more and more interested in drama, I went and asked the pastor, the local pastor at the church, if he could introduce me to Lavington Players, because I thought maybe then I can do my drama there. The guy was the first one who really got me exposed to the reality of racism, because when he went and told the rest of the drama group that I wanted to join them, they said they didn't know that they had any space or any parts for an African to join in.
Wait, so the Lavington Players was white.
Yeah,
white,
it was largely white.
Largely white.
It was very closely associated with Phoenix Players as well.
Yes.
So they said they weren't sure about that. And when the pastor told me that he would come and introduce me, I noticed he was hesitating. And when I went to Lavington Players a couple of times, expecting him to come and introduce me, again, he exhibited this real, disinterest.
Mm-hmm.
So I decided to confront my dad. And I said, you told me to take an interest in this church, and look at what's happening. They're saying that they really don't have any parts for Africans. And that triggered a series of actions. First of all, when Dad went back to his office, he called the pastor and said, "My son tells me he's having real difficulty getting introduced to Lavington Players, and I'm interested to know what the matter is.
Mm-hmm.
Is this something to do with the fact that he's African, or what?" This pastor was so alarmed about this, he made his way to Kenyatta University and came to look for me. I mean, this is a campus with, well over 2,000 students, and he comes to look for Ezra Mbogori. And all the dynamics that opens up, because all these people starts looking around, asking about Ezra Mbogori. There's a Mzungu who's looking for him, stuff like that, And eventually I get to know it is him. And I see him, he was parked outside one of the dining halls. So I go and I greet him, and he says he's been told that I'm concerned that he's not introduced me to the players, and the players were themselves saying that they're not sure that they're going to do any new plays and stuff like that. So I told him, you know what? I'm actually in a drama group already here, and I'm not interested in Lavington Players. You can go and keep your Lavington Players,
Mm-hmm.
So we had a bit of a fight.
Mm-hmm.
He goes back and tells my dad that he's really sorry that this has happened, and he's sorry that his son is traumatized about this and all of that. Long and short of it is 3 months later, he tendered his resignation from the church and actually relocated to Australia with his family.
Oh, wow.
Well, after that. Now, that had an interesting effect on me because I then decided that drama was what I was interested in and not Lavington Players.
Mm-hmm.
And so I joined Tamaduni Players and basically carried on with my school, but cutting a good part of my life dedicated to drama. And that then began my interest in what it is that affected people in their lives and so on. And the whole question of poverty, that's where it all began to take shape in terms of my own thinking. Now, we did plays like Dead End Kimathi and a few other players, which I was involved in. In fact, I acted Kimathi in all of those productions. And that was part of, what peppered my life in college, in Kenyatta University while I was there. So at the end of the degree, like I say, then it was known that I was in drama. It was known too that I was, like I say, a peripheral student leader. But then this is when I got this internship with the World Council of Churches. And so I shifted. I then traveled to Geneva and spent the next 9 months going through, a total mind-blowing experience. There was things like, traveling all these different continents, the being exposed to, poverty situations. And one of the places that I remember spending time in and wondering how life could be like this was going to the largest slum area in the Philippines.
Yes.
Tondo, and spending time and listening to people arguing about or explaining what their lives were like, living in really, really squalid conditions. So spending time doing that impacted very, very positive, very heavily on me. And I hadn't really been exposed to too much of our poverty in Kenya, for instance. But I did some of that. Then while there, during that 9 months as well, I spent time in the US. I spent time in East Europe. I got a chance to even travel to parts of Eastern Europe, to Romania. Had moments when I was reminded that I was black, and that white people saw us as being totally different.
Yes.
Got a chance to, I spent time in Bucharest, for instance, in the Orthodox Church, monasteries, and then when they showed me what was the equivalent of poverty, well, it was totally different. I mean, these people lived what seemed like fairly decent lives, but they also had wants. They had major shortages. I remember asking my brother, who was in Bucharest at the time, what people were queuing up for, and he'd say, "Give me a second," and he'd run over there and ask, "What are we queuing for?" And he'd be told, "This is bread."
Oh, wow.
And it was a bread queue.
Oh, wow.
So that was the way in which poverty, I guess, expressed itself.
Yes.
In those sorts of situations,
Yeah.
So yeah, after the 9 months of thingy, I realized one thing, that I really didn't know my country. That a lot of the questions I was asked by people in all these different places were questions I couldn't answer. What's your country like?
Yeah.
Is it true that young people respect older people? And that, like, if I walked into this room now, would you stand up for me?
Oh, wow.
And I'd say, if you're older than me, I certainly would stand up. You say, is this inert in you? I mean, is it part of your conditioning in life? And stuff like that. Do people live in trees in your country? All those kinds of questions. Yeah, that 9 months, I think, was a real education for me about how misunderstood or how miscommunicated messages about Africa and other parts of the world are.
And it's interesting because then you go and you find people who maybe you connect with.
Yes.
And you're from completely different continents and different life experiences, but you feel such a connection, I guess.
There's a connection, yes.
And that sometimes is a bit mind-boggling, because you're like, how is it that we could come from such different places, but form such deep friendships? I don't know if you had the same experience.
No. That's true. That's absolutely true. And you go away wondering, what is it like? What is it that motivates certain people, as opposed to, where do I go now? So all those questions came, front and center as I was leaving that internship, and making up my mind about what I'm going to do. So when after the 9 months I went back to Kenya, one of the things that happened to me, which I think was itself very telling in terms of what I believed, was in my time in Europe and the US and all during those travels, I realized one thing, that lusting over a car, for instance, owning a car, was not in itself an achievement.
Yeah.
Because, when I was in Geneva, for instance, I'd meet people, we'd agree, let's meet at this and this time. And all it took was my understanding the bus routes.
Yes.
And timing.
Yes.
And I could make any date anywhere, because I knew there was a public transport system that was totally reliable.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I then go back to Kenya, to Nairobi, and find that transport is a real problem. But I tell myself, if I understand the bus routes in this city, I will be able to manage just like I did in Geneva. So I go back. I didn't have very much in the way of savings or anything, but I took a little money, some of the stipends that I'd gotten while I was on my internship. So I put that in my bank account, and then decided that I'm going to manage Nairobi just like I managed Geneva. So
how did that work out?
I go to the bus station. I go to the bus station. It was on Fangano Street. I never forget that. Go to the bus station, and I get every timetable, every bus timetable, and I knew where every bus is going. And I put them on my desk, and I study them all. And I decided from now on, I'm going to manage exactly like the transport system, the public transport system manages. It took 2 weeks. In 2 weeks, I decided this thing is not working at all. So I basically tucked my tail between my legs and went back home and started looking at I had all my savings were about 13,000 shillings.
Okay.
I decided I'm going to look for a car. So I went to, by this time, of course, I had begun to deciding what I want to do. And I had been invited to do a little research project with the National Council of Churches of Kenya. And this is what I got into doing, to sort of find myself, find my feet. And what I did then is I got a friend to help me find a car. And we got this little car from an Asian guy who was selling it for close to 17,000 shillings. And I had only 13,000. And I desperately wanted this car. So this is where even things like races come in, because I get this car, it belongs to an Asian guy. He says he won't allow me to pay him any less than 17,000. I only have 13,000. I get this friend of mine who tells me, listen, if the gap is between 13 and 17, you tell him you want to see it. And this guy was a mechanic. He says, tell him you want to see it and tell him you want to test drive it. So we go with him this Saturday morning, and he takes the car and does a test drive. And he tells me, as we're going, he says, bring that money you had with you. So we go there. There's a place in Nyangara. And he test drives the car. He comes back and he tells me, this car is solid. It's good. It's good. He says, in fact, I'm surprised he's selling it for 17, but we'll get it for you. So we go back to this guy and he tells him, Chief, he only has 13,000. The guy says, no, I told you, I can't take any less than 17,000. That's, the least I will take. So he tells me, okay, give me the money. So I give him the money. He says, now, Chief, this guy he's just starting off in life. He needs his car. And he needs it for his work right now. So here's the money. He takes out this wad of cash. And he says, here's the money. I know you're as sensible as not to turn away money. Give him the key. So he gives him, and then he goes into his pocket and pulls out some more coins. He says, this is the rest. This is all I have. Take it. Give him the car. And to my surprise, the guy says, okay, just this one time I'll let you go. And I got the car. Now the thing is, this car had just enough fuel to get me home to my parents' place. Once I got there, the car started jerking, and clearly it had run out of fuel. I then pushed it into my parents' garage. And this was, as you can imagine, the end of the month, which is why I had been able to withdraw all this money. So I pushed the car into the garage. I borrowed some bus fare, went home. I had moved into, I had rented a little car a little house in Olympic, Kibera. And I managed the rest of that month just between home and my office at Catholic Relief Services. I had already started. Now I had done this research project, and then I got my very first job with Catholic Relief Services, which was a funding and basically a relief agency. So when I got my next paycheck is when I was able to go back to my parents' house with a jerry can of fuel and put it in and then start my car. First time.
A month later.
A month
Talk about delayed gratification.
yeah, so that was like my introducing myself to working life.
Working life, yeah. And in your experiences, like what are some of the most memorable experiences working in the development sector? I mean, some things that stand out for you and had like such impact, personal impact, profound impact on a personal level for you in your journey.
Well, I think there were things like, first of all, coming home and discovering and deciding that I didn't know my country. I really didn't know. So when I got this job, it's in the course of doing my NCCK research project, which was looking at the growth of religion in the country and how certain sects and cults had proliferated in the whole country. I mean, like the Moonies, for instance. The research project I was doing was looking at how the Moonies were growing really fast. The Moonies it's this church started by Reverend Sun Myung Moon, a Korean priest, who had a particular brand of Christianity of his own. And the guy he used to do mass marriages,
Yes.
Huge.
I mean, I distinctly remember that was like in the 90s.
Yeah. That was then. It was the 80s, actually. Yeah.
It was the 80s because I remember that. I mean, I was born in the 80s, so
yeah. Like he had this. It's a very it was the Moonies. You should read about them. But this guy Sun Yun Moon was a very charismatic sort of fellow. But he used to organize mass weddings, and I met in Ukambani. Actually, I met quite a few of those people who had been introduced. Sun Yun Moon used to pick the partners for them. He used to pick spouses.
Oh, wow.
So they'd have these mass marriages that would happen in different places,
And why was it spreading so fast?
Well, I think it's like most cults, they promise you also, they make all sorts of promises, but they're also developing. We're also doing development, like in Ukambani at the time. So that's what I guess captured the imagination of the local people. When you go and you sink a borehole somewhere, then Sun Yun Moon has provided us with water, and so it becomes the next thing that you're giving thanks for, and before you know it, he's captured your imagination, and tells you that his church believes in the goodness of people and stuff like that, and that kind of.
That's interesting. So did you actually get the opportunity to travel the country?
Now, what happened is while I was doing this research, I got I found that there was this advert from the Catholic Relief Services inviting applications for what they called food for work officers, and this was their food aid program. I applied for that job because it said one of the requirements was a driving license, and I was fortunate in that I had a driving license. That's another whole story, how I got my driving license. But anyway, I did have one. So I go to the Catholic Relief Services, I apply for the job, and I told them I had a valid driving license and it had a clean record. I was very young then. So I go for an interview, and the interviewer was a Peace Corps volunteer who was interviewing, they were interviewing several people. And he asked me, first he was surprised that I talk fairly decent English and asked me if I had a driving license. And I said, yes. He said, how did you get it? So, I had to tell a whole story about how I learned how to drive using my parents' car and all of that. He says, did you bring it with you? And I brought it. And says, so he takes a look at it. Then he calls the person who was heading up transport in Catholic Relief Services and says, just check and tell me if this is valid, if this is a genuine driving license. The guy says, yeah, Class E, it's okay. So he asked me, does that mean that if I were to take you out now and give you a car key, you could drive me to town and back? I said, yeah, I didn't see any problem with that. But I realized then that it is that they had people who had driving licenses, but were still learning how to drive.
Oh, yeah, okay.
You know how this whole story about bribing for the driving,
Mm.
you know? So this guy, Henry Lowe, I even remember his name, he asks Joseph to give him a key for the Land Cruiser. He tells me, okay, come with me. And we leave a whole bunch of people outside there who are sitting on chairs waiting for the
Waiting for
interview.
the
as well.
interview. Mm.
So he tells me, we're going in that Land Cruiser. So I go and I grab it. He tells me, one thing you might not know is how to heat the coil of a diesel Land Cruiser. So let me show you. So he taught me how to heat the coil and how to start it. He tells me, we're going to go across to Westlands and back. Do you know your way to Westlands? I said, I think I can find my way. He says, okay, let's go. So we go and we get close to Westlands. When we get near the roundabout, he says, okay, turn around, let's go back. So we go back and he says, I'm satisfied you can drive. You clearly are confident. So let's go back in. So we go back in and the rest of the panel was still waiting for, these guys, that's how arrogant they were. They're still waiting for us as a panel. So he sits there and he tells the panel, guys, I've heard everything I wanted to hear from this young man. Unless any of you have any questions for him, I think we're done. He asked me, how soon can you report? I said, well, as soon as you need me, I can be here next Monday. This was something like Wednesday. So he asked the other people, does any other questions? And so they said no. And they respected him because he's a white Peace Corps volunteer. So he tells me, okay, Ezra, we'll call you. We'll call you in the next few days. We will definitely have you here on Monday. So I walked away knowing I got the job, even though there were people still waiting for interviews, And he himself, this guy, decided that he did not want to hear anymore because he found his candidate, and that's all he cared about. So from then on, I was called a food for work officer, and I came the following Monday, reported to work, and then what they did is they gave me the key for another Land Cruiser and told me your work is to travel all the drought-stricken areas of this country and report back on the state of famine. And you're the one who'll be recommending how much food we should take to each of these different places and report situations of famine, how bad it is, and where we needed what we called then PL 480. That there was a particular vote in USAID food aid. And so, we need to report on where they need PL 480 food and do food for work programs. Yeah. So for the next several months, I traveled the whole country. From, say, Moyale, border with Ethiopia, to Turkana, to all over. And I'm doing this reporting. Now, after a few months, part of what started worrying me is that food for work is really basically just keeping people alive. That there was no development happening. And we were questioning whether food for work really works. Does it enable people to then get back on their feet? And what do you do? And some economists had brought in the idea of converting some of this food by putting it on the market, and that way enabling those who are able to farm post-famine, post-drought, to actually get into farming and helping them, teaching them farming, that sort of thing. So as this debate is going on, and I'm beginning to pitch in and say, maybe we should do something that sustain communities and so on, there's change of leadership at Catholic Relief Services. The new guy that comes into Catholic Relief Services was a Brazilian fellow, was married to an American, which is why he was able to be the director of Catholic Relief Services in Kenya, because there had to be an American heading up an agency like that. So this guy comes in, he looks at the staff profile, and he has them call me. And he says, I hear you're the one who knows everything about food distribution in this country. And I tell him what I know. And he says, now listen, I understand that the relations between the Catholic bishops in this country, and CRS are not very good. So my job is to try and improve those. So you can expect me to do a lot of schmoozing with the bishops from now on. And I know you're a young man, you're Kenyan, you're interested in developing Kenya, and you know what it is that they want in development here. So here's the deal. I'm going to give you a chance to employ some of your ideas around developing this country, right? And I'm going to support you. If the ideas are sound, I'm going to support you all the way. But here's what I want you to understand, that if this thing works and it's really successful, then I'm going to get all the credit because I'm the head of this agency. I'm the one who's taking risks, right? Do we have a deal? And we shook on the deal.
Yeah, okay.
So I said, fine, I'll do it. He says, okay, Ezra, you go and think about what you're going to do. And I'm going to start reaching out to some of these bishops and see if I can get some of them to start liking me. So that's how that. Now, soon after that, he appointed me what was called the project officer, which meant that I had a hand in deciding where to allocate some of our funding for some of our development projects. And so I basically started feeling out and started writing proposals, putting together strategies and that sort of thing. And I mean, as a sign of how much he trusted me, he made me a signatory to one of the bank accounts, which had not happened in this country before. In fact, some of his colleagues in CRS in New York started complaining that you can't make a Kenyan employee a signatory because these guys are very under tremendous pressure. And so this guy says, well, I don't care about what you guys think, but I trust Ezra. He's going to be a signatory. So that was part of the tension that began to set in. But what it also enabled me to do is to think about some of the decisions that needed to be made. So like one story I remember, here I am working for Catholic Relief Services, a Catholic agency, right? My father, like I said, is a Protestant bishop of a Protestant church, Methodist church. Some women who were on both sides of the debate around pro-life and pro-choice got to know that this man, Ezra Mbogori, is making decisions around pro-life and pro-choice campaigns. So they go to my dad and they say, your son is funding those people that are killing children and supporting abortions and all. So my dad totally innocently says, I have no idea about any of that. I don't know what my son does. I just know that he works somewhere and he has to work in order to make a living. But, how can you tell me that he's funding pro-choice or any of that stuff? So they say, no, you tell him we just want fair treatment. And that if he's going to fund them, he needs to fund as well. So this woman came to see me at my office because when Dad told them that, he told them, look, you go and see him yourself and tell him that. So this woman comes to see me and says, first it was the nuns. Some nuns had come to see me, and they had said that they wanted to conduct a campaign on pro-life, and that they also thought that we need to create more awareness around abortion, and that it's sinful and inhuman and all that. So I told these nuns, send me a proposal. Simple as that. And let's see if what you're asking for makes sense. We will support it. We'll support the campaign. So they sent a proposal. I looked at the proposal. It looked reasonable. It did not do anything illegal. And it did not mean that we supported pro-choice or pro-life positions. So, and the reason that this happened actually with the nuns is because they went to Palmarie, that boss who had told, who put me in that job in the first place. When they went to Palmarie said, sister, come, let me introduce you. So he brings her to my office and he says, this lady is very, very industrious. You need to talk to her. She has a proposal for you. So she explains what she wanted me to fund. And I told her, fine. Marie said, you had a proposal, so why don't you show me that proposal? So she said, okay, I'll get it to you. So she sends a proposal. Now it is that these Protestant women had heard that we have funded this campaign.
Yes.
So she came to me, and this woman comes to me in the office
Mhm.
and says, I know you're funding the Catholics.
Mhm.
Now we must be funded as well. And she says, and I know your father, and I've even gone and reported you to your father. So then I put two and two together. I realized. So I said, look, she's brought me a proposal. Do you want to do a proposal as well? We'll see what we can do. So they brought me a proposal as well. I looked at the proposal. It was counter to the other one, like you might imagine. But I didn't think that it broke any rules as such. So I looked at it. And actually, this one, I even went to Marie and said, I need your advice on this. He says, hey, listen, this is people trying to cancel each other out. You decide. So I decided to fund them as well. So we gave the pro-choice group the $5,000 they needed, and we gave a pro-life group the $5,000 they needed. And I said, look, if it is going to remain at the ideas levels, I can't take any, I can't take any positions and say that I'd be blamed, because whoever persuades the other, that's good for them. And so, that was one of the things that I felt really good about. But it also introduced me to the dynamics and politics of international aid, because we also had to do proposals for some of the projects we were doing at Catholic Relief Services. And during that time, Marie, well, what happened, just to finish off Marie's story, is after he'd been there for like 2 years, we got a new international director for Catholic Relief Services. And in the head office, they had heard how well Kenya was doing. Kenya was doing really well, and how impressed the bishops' conference was of the Catholic Relief Services program in Kenya. So they told the new international director he must come to Kenya and see what it is that they're doing right. So his international director comes to Kenya. Marie gets to hear that he's coming, comes and tells me, guess what? International director is coming. I say, that's great. Is that good or bad? And he says, hey, it's fantastic. I mean, maybe these guys are starting to pay attention to what we're doing. And he was told that the Catholic bishops had been really, really gung-ho about this, what this Marie guy is doing, So we received the director, this international director. He had dinner with Marie, and he told Marie he's so impressed with what Marie is doing that he wants to introduce because Marie, like I said before, is Brazilian. He told him he wants to put him in a place where he can continue to do this work, but where he feels more comfortable. He says, how about I post you as the regional director for Brazil? No, for Latin America. So Marie said, oh, that would be wonderful. I'd really appreciate that. That night, when Marie was told that he's going to be appointed the regional director for Latin America, Marie told his driver, he called his driver and he told him, listen, I don't care if you know where Ezra lives, but you've got to take me there now. I want to see Ezra right now. So he comes to my house and he tells me, guess what? I've become the new bureau director for Latin America for Catholic Relief Services. You know why? Because you worked your ass off. So you've done really well. I mean, this guy is impressed with us. He doesn't know what we've been doing, So I'm going to take him to all these different places, but I want you to know you get the credit for some of that too.
Yeah, nice.
So, that was, so we had this relationship that, I was touched that he told the driver he doesn't care where I live. He doesn't care if he knows, but he's got to find out and take him there. Yeah. Because he wanted me to be the first one
to hear
to know that he's been promoted on account of my work. So that was really. Now it's after that he announced, soon after he left and went to Latin America, his successor, who, as you can imagine, was not a real fan. I mean, I wasn't his fan because he wanted to know who is this Ezra guy that is a signatory to the Catholic Relief account and all that. So he began to find ways of closing my space, and he began to contradict some of the decisions I was making and all. So as I was coming up to 5 years in Catholic Relief Services, I decided, yep, this is not working. So I quit. And just as I quit, there was a Dutch fellow who was heading up, who was a volunteer at Undugu Society, who had heard about some of the work that I'd been doing at Catholic Relief Services. And Undugu Society, as you know, was founded by Father Arnold Grohl, a Dutch priest. And when he heard that this guy is working with Catholic Relief Services, they were interested in, whether they could attract me to come and work with Undugu Society, because Undugu Society then was being run by a volunteer who himself was an Italian, but who had been a priest before. So this Dutch volunteer is the one who sought me out and said, listen, I've just heard that you've tendered your resignation to leave Catholic Relief Services. Would you like to come and see some of the things we were doing? And I'd be interested in, what you think. So I went and met him at his office. Next thing I knew is he was offering me a consultancy to look at how I would transition an organization from its current status to, a well-grounded Kenyan organization working with street children. So I asked him, what do you actually want? He says, I want you to come and run this organization. And I said, Undugu Society then was a fairly big organization. More than 110 staff.
Oh, wow.
Working with street children, and doing some really interesting projects, This guy gave me this, 2-month assignment. I began looking at what it is doing and was not sure that it is what I wanted to get into. But, these guys, I guess, enticed me enough about what it is that I could do, and they were telling me, look, what we're doing is giving you an opportunity to play a role that we know you can play. So, don't turn it on. Just, the guy told me that he knows I had applied for a job with World Food Program, which was true. And he says, World Food Program may pay you a good salary, but beyond that, there's really nothing to it. Here, you get to see how to affect the lives of poor people and make a difference for them. So I did this consultancy reluctantly. And then when I handed in a report, he looked at it. He and the director, the then director of Undugu Society, looked at the report, and they then told me that they wanted to convene a meeting of their board to discuss that report and then tell me what role they'd like me to play. What he did is he called his board together. They discussed this report, and then they decided, okay, here's how we'd like to proceed. We need to create a position of deputy director of Undugu Society, and we need to appoint this guy in that position. And because Peter had been doing this research and discovered that I had applied to other places, he told the board, listen, this guy is not available for us for whatever length of time. We need to do this, so let's tie him down. He says, we simply do it we know he would be interested. We simply do it by offering him a decent salary, something that competes with what he was getting at Catholic Relief Services, but appoint him in that position. And then tell him, if he does not accept the appointment, then he can ask the board if he can be dropped from it. But other than that, let's do it that way. So this guy, Fabio Delape, calls me and tells me he'd like a meeting, and I go to see him. And he tells me, this is what happened. It was a very dramatic meeting at the board. They said that they like your report, but that they need for somebody who is knowledgeable about this stuff to come and implement the report. So you know what they've decided to do? They've created the position of deputy director, and they've said the deputy director's role will be to implement Ezra Mbogori's report. So he said, so now you tell me when you're going to start, and we can carry on. So in a sense, you're telling me you've got a job, and he says the details we can discuss, but I can't tell you that that you can drop it, you can refuse it now. You have to talk to the board if you want to refuse that position. That's how I got into Catholic into Ndugu Society, and became its deputy director in one swoop without even talking about it. So then it became a question of, okay, how do I then adapt into this new position? Because Fabio told me he was actually going to be leaving in 3 months. So he says, so you be deputy director, just so that Fabio was an Italian guy, and he was an amazing guy. He appreciated that I did not, that people might not trust me because I'm black. So he would tell me straight to the face, look, some of these people will refuse to give you money because you're a black man. They're giving me money because they say I'm white. They don't realize I can be as crookish as even you can be, that sort of thing. So we went through a transition with him very quickly. And I then basically stepped from deputy director to become director, not very long after that.
All right.
Yeah.
So how was your journey into, I wanted to move into the conversation around how the NGO Coordination Act came to be.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Actually, it goes seamlessly to that. I then get into Ndugu Society. I become the director. And then we get to hear that at that time, the economy in Kenya was doing quite badly. And the levels of corruption and misuse of resources were already being, creating real ripples amongst donors especially. Donors were worried about, how their resources were being used and accountability for those resources. And organizations like Ndugu Society were attracting much more support, from the donor world. So it gets to a point where Moi even started appointing, creating new ministries. There was the Ministry of Arid and Semi-Arid Lands, that was created at the time. And it was entirely dependent on donor funding. So there were those kinds of strategies that they were adopting because they just were not getting the resources they needed as a country or investment. So at one of those Paris Club meetings, this was the era of structural adjustment programs as well. We were being restructured over and over again. Now, at one of the Paris Club meetings, one of the donors was as honest as to say, we are not planning to provide any more funding to Kenya because we are not confident that these resources are being put to the best use possible. So we are not going to be funding there. And they said that instead we are putting our investments in the NGO sector. So word gets to Moi very quickly that NGOs are the ones are going to be the
new recipients.
The new recipients of our support. So Moi asks, who are those NGOs? And he's told these organizations being run by, different agencies and all. So he asks, so why can't we then take, when it's given to them, why can't we take it? So he's told, no, there has to be a law. That was the origin of the NGO Coordination Act.
Oh, wow.
Because it's decided, okay, we have to find a way of controlling. So if this money comes to these NGOs, how do we make sure it comes through government? Then we can control how much of it they use. Yeah. The NGO Coordination Act of 1990 was a direct object to control funding coming in from donors, whether it's coming to government or to whoever else. Now, when the bill, the NGO Coordination Bill of 1990, was first tabled in Parliament, we were warned, and we now as NGOs, some of us NGO types, got to know that this is a direct measure to control the NGO sector. And so we began to ask questions amongst each other. What do we do? How do we make sure that this does not, it does not act to control? Because, it had things like even they are going to register all NGOs and give them practicing licenses. And it was no longer, a given that you register an organization and you can function wherever you want, however you want, with whatever resources you have, So we had reason then to question this as well. Mm-hmm. When this thing was tabled, it sent panic waves across all of us, So a few of us started to consult with each other and ask, what do we do? I happened to have, now at the time, I knew that the Attorney General then, this is a time when Moi was trying to this is just before he set up his dream team. There's a time of
there's a dream team.
Yeah. So what happened is when these guys wrote up the NGO Coordination Act, we then had to mount a campaign because we thought this bill, if it passes, then NGOs are going to be controlled, and we could not have that. So that's when we began to educate ourselves about how do you oppose a bill like this? Mm-hmm. How do you stop it becoming law? Mm-hmm. Now, part of the dream team had been the appointment of Amos Wako as the Attorney General. He was known to be a human rights lawyer, yes. And so,
it's so funny. I don't even think of him as having been a human rights lawyer.
I know he was, yeah, but he was. So when the bill got into Parliament, and in fact they were saying, when he asked who NGOs were, he was told, "Nia watu kama nini, I'm a priest." There was this priest father. There's the priest who was in Gong. I forget his name. No, not Kaiser, but it's another one. Anyway, he was one who Moi hated particularly. But then the other person that they mentioned was Wangari Maathai. Say, NGO ni kama hii kina green belt, hawa Wangari Maathai, And that's another one that Moi couldn't stand either. So all these, became reasons to control these NGOs, to find ways of controlling them. So we began to mount an opposition to this thing. It went into Parliament, and whereas, people were expecting you can talk to MPs, talk to your MP, tell them. This thing was passed in the space of a few weeks.
Oh, wow. And like when you were doing your campaigning, how was campaigning done in those days?
No, you reach out to MPs. It was basically reaching out to MP and telling them, please speak against this. And you see, MPs were also really scared. So when you talk to them, there's no knowing whether they'll go and speak against it or not. So it was tough going. But what did happen though is that when the bill was passed, it received Moi's assent in no time. He approved it. And then NGOs knew we were in trouble. Now, I'm trying to remember the sequence of events, but I recall that once it received presidential assent, we knew that NGOs are going to be controlled, registration, and they were going to call for NGO registration because then we were subject to the NGO Coordination Board, So as soon as it had received presidential assent, Biwott was the Minister for Internal Affairs, and his ministry put out an advertisement that all NGOs are required to register with the NGO Coordination Board. Around that time, I was already in conversation with a few other NGO types about creating a new organization that was going to help expand the NGO sector and provide training to NGOs that require to expand. The question, basically the question that started us talking was this: we were asking ourselves, why is it that local NGOs are not growing and flourishing? Especially when we hear donors saying we're going to channel all our investments through the NGO sector. So we're asking ourselves, how is it that every time there's a disaster, it is international NGOs that simply parachute in and provide their support?
Yes.
Why don't local NGOs thrive? Why don't they grow? And so that, I guess, is subject for another whole long discussion that had taken place. But based on that question, we began to ask ourselves, okay, how do we oppose this thing? Because it's going to get in our way. And it is at that time that then we decided there has to be a way in which we resist this thing. We knew then, some of the strategists amongst us knew that the donors who fund us are also funding ministries like the Ministry for Arid and Semi-Arid Lands. And if we can get them to talk to government and say, we don't like this law, maybe government would be willing to change this law. So we developed strategies to talk to them, some of these donors. And at one of those Paris Club meetings, we got, I think it was UNICEF, to go and make mention that they feel that NGOs are under a lot of pressure because of the new law that's been introduced in Kenya, and that they are uneasy about continuing to work with them. And they also have decided they're not going to fund government departments like the Ministry of Arid and Semi-Arid Lands, unless these laws can be looked at, unless a conversation can happen. So that became a way of encouraging government to talk to us.
Yes.
Yeah.
And did it work?
So we began to prepare ourselves. And we got some of the lawyers in the sector, people like Mutaza Jaffa, in fact, even Willy Mutunga, we talked to them and said, okay, how do we change this law? And they are the ones who told us, okay, if you need to change, here are the things that, in that act that had been passed, here are the things that must change. And I remember then we went to like I say, Wako was the Attorney General, and I was the director of Undugu Society. Wako, by a strange twist of fate, happened to be a trustee of Undugu Society.
Oh, wow.
So when we were told, talk to the Attorney General and tell him these are the things you need to change, I then simply called the Attorney General's office and said, Bwana Wako, you're one of my trustees. I've been instructed by my board to talk to you because we have a really urgent problem which only you can help us solve. So he says, okay, come. So I went. And we went with that law that as we had it, and we said this law needs to change. And we had gone through this really rigorous exercise of finding out what things in that law needed to change. And the lawyers we were with then had told us, look, there's 13 things that must be changed. Of those 13, there's 8 that are critical. The others you can negotiate. So we go to WACO. Now, what we had done is, in suggesting those changes, we had even gotten a printer, somebody to print the exact changes that need to be made, and even draft it in legal language, like drafts, like normal draftsmen. We consulted even draftsmen. Eh? By the time the bit I left out is that as we were getting to all this, we had called all the other NGOs and said, we are concerned about this law. You want to join? And in fact, we developed a system where I said, I was worried, I know that there's at least 5 other colleagues who are directors of NGOs who would be willing to come. So within three meetings, we had about 150 people who came to the meeting. And that's where we developed this strategy. Now, this strategy, like I say, when we had developed all the changes that we wanted, we then went to meet with ACO, with our lawyer, and we gave him copies, and we told him, now, we have suggested these are the changes that must be made, and what changed, how they could be made. Said, and we have brought you copies of the new bill, like it should look, we brought you 258 copies for every MP. So if you give us instructions now, every pigeonhole can have one, and this thing can be tabled in Parliament next week, and it can be debated. And we have put in motion a process of lobbying all the MPs. So all we need is your word. So Waka looks at this and says, Ezra, you guys, no, this is embarrassing. How can you do this? I mean, and you've even put it in language like our draftsman. So you say, yeah. He said, that's how serious it is. No. Let's be honest. There's no way I can, as Attorney General, I can allow you people, civilians, to come and do my work. No. So we can't do that. You tell me what you want to change. So we had the lawyer go through those things. He said, okay, look, you leave it to me. Let me see how we deal with this. But we're definitely not going to table your bill. not in Parliament, So we had that discussion happen. And what WACO chose to do is to put it in miscellaneous amendments. So a lot of those things were amended that way, And then we knew we have grounds to, we had something to work with.
Yeah.
So after that, it is those amendments that even resulted in the creation of the NGO Council, and all of that. And it is at that point that we then told NGOs they should go ahead and register with the thingy with the NGO board, with the NGO board, coordination board. And so then we got on to the point of where the board was being created, and the government was very, very particular about how this was all going to be managed. In fact, I became the chair of the NGO Council, purely by a twist of fate, because the members who had registered, and during the, in the run up to the week that the meeting was being held, I was out of the country. I was actually fundraising with for Undugu Society. And then the lady, I remember Mrs. Mwango, she was the one who was supposed to come and convene that meeting to vote, to elect a new board. And she saw the paperwork and then said that she wanted my acceptance to serve as chair if I am elected. I was out of the country, so they couldn't get me to sign any piece of paper. So she said, no, then if he's not there, then we can't, why don't you just nominate somebody else to be chair? These guys called me, some colleagues called me in Amsterdam and said, listen, you've been nominated for chair, to run for the chair position, and they must have your signature. So I said, but I'm in Holland. What do this guy called me and told me, I'm going to sign for you. And I'll sign as close to your signature as possible, but then you will have to tell them, yes, you're the one who signed. So we agreed. Yeah. So he went and took the signature in to Mrs. Catherine Mwango, and she didn't know what my signature was like. So the election happened. I got a call later from another friend who said, hey, congratulations, Mr. Chairman. You're the new chair of the NGO Council. So then from there, we continue to work on, improving like that negotiation with WACO and stuff like that. It carried on from then on. But the negotiations themselves were fairly harrowing. I mean, there were splits within the sector, all sorts of things, it made for interesting storytelling later, going on. But yeah, we had some interesting times there.
Awesome. So you're saying there's lots of intrigues around the NGO Coordination Act.
Yeah. Well, you see, when as we were negotiating, amendments to the PBO, to the NGO Coordination Act, things got to a point where government was really insisting on its implementation, and going on. At the time, the Minister for Local government, no, not local government, for interior, the guy in charge of intelligence and all that was Biwott. And his ministry put out this advert that all NGOs should register. Now, at that time, we were wondering, how do we resist a thing like this? The Friday that the advert came out saying all NGOs should register, I was consulting with a few of the lawyers that we had and all, while we were negotiating, just as we were about to go and negotiate with WACO. And one of them told me, somebody needs to tell NGOs not to register, to simply go and go against that advice altogether. So what I did is I went and put an advert in the Nation newspaper, using Undugu Society money, advising NGOs not to register. And I knew that was going to be contrary, and that, people advised me that makes you puts you in a lot of danger. But I thought to myself, there's no other way of communicating to my colleagues that this is a really dangerous thing to do. So I put an advert in on the Friday evening. It appeared on a Saturday. And that Saturday morning, I went off to Zimbabwe.
Oh, wow.
I spent a week in Zimbabwe. I did get to hear that when the advert came in the papers, there were some people looking for Mbogori at Undugu Society, and there were people who wanted to know where I lived as well. Now, I don't want to speculate. I didn't want to act like, maybe they're after me or anything, but I had reason to feel insecure. I came back, like I said, a week later, and basically just melded into my normal activities like everybody else. And so while there was that sense of concern all along, and people were telling me to be careful and all, we figured, let's not act, like we're scared until we have reason to show that we are scared. So then it's after that we carried on and went to WACO. Went to see Mr. WACO. Now, a while after that, we had been advised to also see somebody in the Ministry of the Interior. And we were advised that a certain Mr. Kaguthi was the one in charge of the NGO Coordination Act at the time. And so he called us to a meeting and he said, tell them all to come there, since they keep insisting on these amendments. Tell them to come. So we go to this meeting, and we discovered that he said he too had invited his own NGOs, the ones that he knew. And at that meeting, we found a few NGO leaders as well, who I will not name, but some of them were clearly betraying our cause, and who we discovered were actually advising government how to control us a little more. And it is at that point that we realized that we had a much bigger battle on our hands than we had realized we had before. So then word got out, about this. But the important thing is that meeting with this man, Mr. Kaguthi, in the office of the president, was one where he walks into the office after we've all been brought into the room and, given the seats and all, and he's brought his NGO types there as well. So we're asking each other, what's so-and-so doing here? So he walks in and he walks in very dramatically and says, who is this Mbogori? So I stick my hand up, I say, I'm here. He says, you're the one who thinks you can contradict even the word of kidole ya mzee. Hii kitu imepata kidole, and you still come and say you want to amend it. Yeah? Kwani wewe nani? So I say, my name is Mbogori. And some people laughed. But that in terms of feeling really, really scared, that it puts fear in you when you're being asked, who do you think you are? At that point.
And contradicting,
Exactly.
contradicting, a document.
Kidole mbaya na kidole ya mtukufu rais.
Yes.
So,
the finger of the president.
This is it. So there were moments like that. That was one particularly good moment, interesting moment. The other one, like I say, was one of meeting with Wako, which I described, where he was totally embarrassed by the fact that we brought, all these copies of amended legislation for him to table in Parliament, and that we had even found the fonts, what fonts were used by the government printer to do an exact thing, so that we told him, you need to do nothing. Just allow us to go. And we said, we have come with a labor, allow us to go into the halls and put into the 258 pigeonholes of every MP, and they will all have it by 5 o'clock this evening. And he said, no. He's smiling and saying, no. Ezra, you can't do this. No, this is wrong. A government officer cannot allow this kind of thing to happen. So, that happened, and so on.
And so ultimately, where did it reach that you felt, personal threat to the point where you were like, okay, I don't think I can stay here anymore. I can work in the sector in Kenya anymore.
Well, what happened is, like I say, I had gone off. The reason I had gone off to, put the advert in the paper and then flown off to Zimbabwe was because I had already been in conversation with other NGO leaders about the need to create a support NGO that would work with NGOs in Eastern and Southern Africa. Now, there's some events that had led to these colleagues saying, maybe, Ezra, you should consider going on to set this support organization, a reflection and development center for NGOs in Eastern and Southern Africa. You should lead it and set it up somewhere. Now, this is, it goes into many other stories, but what basically it all amounts to is the reason I had gone to Zimbabwe was to follow up that discussion about the creation of a reflection and development center for NGOs. There was also talk about the possibility of setting up a center like that in Zimbabwe. We had talked about either setting it up in Zimbabwe or in Zambia or in other countries of Eastern and Southern Africa. Reading the moods as it was, Kenya was not a very likely place because of the troubles we were having as NGOs with the government anyway, So we had reached out to the Zimbabwean government, and the Zimbabwean government at the time, under Mugabe, had said, you're very welcome to come and set it up here. So we felt that, here's a possibility that we could go and set up there. And so it is that led to then our deciding, since there were these fears about what would happen to some of the leadership, and I had been elected to chair the NGO council, then I felt that the moment had come for me to actually decamp and go on to Zimbabwe, set up this new organization, and let my colleagues in the NGO sector carry on with the NGO council and go on with the establishment or improvement of relationships with government and with the donors and so on. So that's really what got me to finally in 1992 leave Nairobi and take my family and go on to Zimbabwe.
So you find that, okay, so we have this new legislation, the amendments have been made and they've been put in. Were they passed eventually?
Yes. The miscellaneous amendments were made and they were passed, and it had been an act, but after the amendments, what happened in that negotiation with Amos Wako, remember I told you that I had been advised that there are 13 amendments that must be passed.
Yes.
And of those 13, there were 5 that were critical.
Yes.
Well, we got them all.
Okay. Wow.
So the amendments were passed, and now the NGO council could be formed, and the board was brought into effect. So, as I left as chair of the NGO council, and they had elections soon after me, and a successor came in place. So when I left, I felt that had basically closed that chapter fairly well. And Undugu society was not under any real threat as such,
And the thing is, it's so interesting because then, fast forward maybe 20 years later.
Now, fast forward and we come in 2009, I get back into the country after having taken time off and done some sabbatical time. And I then get taken in by Akiba Uhaki Foundation. And I start asking questions about whatever happened with that law. Have we ever perfected it to the point where is it doing what we were hoping it would do? And I'm told, actually that law is in need of revision. And I talked to some of my old colleagues in the NGO sector, and they all agree, it needs to be amended, it needs to be revised. And so a few of us start talking very casually about, what could be done to provide the kind of law that we need, a law that provides the right environment for investment, for donors to invest, and one that actually even encourages investment. I mean, and one of the things that we were very, very particular about is tax rebates,
Yes.
and enabling
tax
NGOs,
incentives,
giving incentives,
yes,
exactly,
for philanthropy.
How do you promote incentives of that nature? So a few of us asked, in having this conversation, there was 2 or 3 of us that offered to convene like a monthly meeting where we could say, how can we in the NGO sector influence a thing like this to happen? And so we decided, okay, and we would do one at Akiba Uhaki, another one at Mazingira Institute, another one at AMREF, and this because the leaders of those organizations were, actively supporting that kind of conversation. So we decided, a starting point would be where we create that law ourselves first, and then we can approach, the legal community to refine it for us, make it, make it into what we would like to see. And so we began to have these monthly meetings where, a few of us would donate a little money for biscuits and sodas, whatever. And these conversations went on pretty well. And then at a certain point we said, let's not talk about it as NGOs. Let's not call them NGOs anymore. Somebody came and said, these are public benefit organizations. Why don't we then become the instigators of the creation of a PBO law?
Yeah. And I think it was even right after South Africa had the public benefit organizations law had been passed.
Yeah. So, now we decided we would begin from first principles. What should a law like this?
Like from the basics.
Yeah, absolute basics. What would we like to see? And what should it try and achieve and stuff like that, We're trying to be as philosophical as possible, So that conversation went on over several months. Eventually we got to a point where we realized that, in the same way as sometimes the government will do a sessional paper that describes something, well, we said we're getting to the point where maybe this law that we're thinking about should become the subject of a discussion with government as well. And the ministry, it was now a ministry for Home Affairs, I think, that was the custodian of the NGO Coordination Act. So we said maybe we should talk to them about, we want to revise, we want this all, we would desire a thing like this. And we're looking at how can we do it in a way that is attractive to them as well. So we began to talk about it. And then we got to a point where we said, when the ideas we had been gathering for some time started to really take shape, we then thought, wait, now that we have a new, in 2010, once the constitution had been promulgated, we then asked ourselves, look, we shouldn't be begging these guys to table a new law for us, because this is something that can actually be done by a citizen.
Yes, private members.
Private members motion.
Bill. Yeah.
So we thought, okay, then let's go ahead and refine it and get to the point where we can get, and quite a few of us, there were members of parliament who had been in Oxfam and places like that.
Yes.
So we thought, why not?
Yes, you had allies already in parliament.
So we go to one MP and say to him, we have this law and we are thinking of it, making its way to Parliament through a private member's motion. He says, yeah, sure, bring it. Let me, That's how it ended up getting into Parliament. Now, once it got into Parliament, we had mentioned, like I said before, to the ministry, and we had said, we're thinking of this. And they'd said, yeah, let's keep talking about it. Then they hear it being mentioned in Parliament. Come back to us, what the hell? What's happening? How can you guys do this? So they decided we had done an end run on them, and, So it became contentious for some time. But then we told them, listen, this is just a private member's motion. If you want to support it, we're quite happy. And, we can show you what it is that we're thinking, we're talking about. So we carried on with discussions for quite a while. And you see, they had ideas about what they thought needed to be changed. There are certain things, certain controlling features that they would have really liked to be in that law. So that's what became contentious, because there are certain things which we thought should remain. We wanted a totally unadulterated law. And we wanted to, basically develop naturally. But they had certain concerns about how it should develop as well, And so these are the things that created real friction between us, Now, once it was read in Parliament the first time, we went and talked to them and said, it's still in the stage where it can be amended. So, why don't we talk about what you would like to see? And some of the people in the bureau now were uneasy about it because of the feeling that they are the ones who should have taken the lead, So it was a delicate balancing act for us. What do we accept and what do we, totally reject?
Reject, absolutely.
So it was a tough sort of moment for us to begin with. But eventually we got to the point where because I think we had persuaded a lot of PBOs that this made sense, it almost got a snowballing effect. It grew with time to the point where they couldn't resist it anymore.
And I remember at the time is when the international organizations came in because there was provisions for how.
And that's when it's around that time that we created the NGO. What is it called?
Civil Society Reference Group.
Civil Society Reference Group.
Yeah.
Civil Society Reference Group was that first group of people that I told you, we were meeting monthly.
Yeah.
We said we will act. Look, we don't want to create new structures and institutions. No, we will simply act as a reference. In fact, this is something I told somebody. Look, we will simply act as a reference group. If any NGO wants our advice, we'll be happy to advise them. But if we want, to collectively discuss anything, we'd like to be able to call them all together. And that's how those things evolve. So we were not creating things for any particular reason, but just to do things logically. That's all we were looking to do.
And that was so interesting because at the time when I joined, it was coming in to represent. So there's all these different actors who have different interests to come International, there's the trusts and foundations. That's how I came in. There was the grassroots. CBOs who were interested in it. There was the ones who are already registered as not NGOs under the coordination bureau.
Yes. And then there were the CBOs in the ministry and stuff like that. Yeah. So we were basically just looking at what is it that can improve the health of the civil society in whatever form they are, and how do you facilitate rather than distract them or destroy their possibilities. That whole question, how do you help a sector grow?
Yes. Yes.
That's really what was preoccupying us more than anything else.
And I remember it was like, how do you create an enabling environment for...
Exactly. Now, that language we got from the Aga Khan. There was in fact an enabling environment conference.
What?
Which I had been involved with in another organization, After I left, just before I joined Undugu Society, after I left Catholic League Services, I did a year with a USAID-funded organization called VADA, Voluntary Agencies Development Assistance. This was an organization which I was really embarrassed to be involved with, because the director was a guy who literally told the accountant he was hiring, "Hey, we found a pot of money. Come and help me. Come and help me pick from it." Because he realized that USAID will fund a good idea and won't ask too many questions. So what he did is he got a few good names, like Bethuel Kiplagat and all, to be on his board, and then he hired a few professional hires, and I happened to be one of them. I was the first NGO hire that he made, and he told me, he offered me what he thought was a decent salary, and then told me, "We'll revise this in no time, a few months. You wait until the grant comes from USAID." Then I realized this is not what I wanted to do, which is why I was happy to just leave them and join, go do that consultancy with Ndugu Society, and then, But that time, I realized then that there were people who were in this thing for the money. It was USAID funding.
And the Conference on Enabling Environment?
Now, the Conference on Enabling Environment was done by the Aga Khan. The Aga Khan had thought of this as a way of facilitating NGOs. He was setting up his Aga Khan Development Network
here. Yeah. Akidian, yeah.
And so he comes to Kenya, sets up this Conference on Enabling Environment, which is talking about, I think his staff were looking at, how do you respond to these NGOs that don't seem to know what they're doing, what they're about, I think it was one of the ways of responding, by creating this conference and getting all the bigwigs to come and, share some of their ideas there. But I remember that some of the research that preceded this is research we were asked to do. And I remember commissioning a person like Sam Kobia to go and do some work with NGOs in Zimbabwe, for instance, about how they were, what for them constituted an enabling environment, as a precursor to this conference on enabling environment. Yeah. So,
So that's the language. And I remember when I first joined the sector and people were talking about enabling environment for civil, and I would just be like, what exactly are you saying? What exactly does that mean? Because it meant nothing to me.
It's amazing. I mean, again, it's amazing how people can use some of this language to bamboozle everybody else, and then make it so high sounding. So
I know.
I remember one of the guys who were involved in that conference coming and telling me, "Listen to His Highness, you will really enjoy what he's saying." He said, "Did you hear that? Enabling environment." Kumbe, he's one who's been putting that into his mouth. It's amazing.
So, and for me, what do you think are just some of the really important things that this Public Benefit Organizations Act did, based on its approach that it was basically sector-led, and the difference between then how it changed from what the Coordination Act was?
Yeah, I think what it did is first of all educate a lot of us in the NGO sector regarding what we had not articulated, but was our desires all along. You see, things like negotiating this whole question of incentives, tax incentives, and beginning to demonstrate that it wasn't just the incentives, but also what was the end goal. This, principles like working ourselves out of a job, like creating dependency. You see, a thing like when I was at Ndugu Society, we did a project, and this will again demonstrate that fact. We did a project in Ndugu Society. We were talking about street children, and there was a group of citizens. There was a supplement in the newspaper that talked about what to do about these 3 children. And in these letters to the auditor, one person wrote and said, "What happened to Ndugu Society? I thought they're the ones who are supposed to deal with these children. Where the hell are they? We're getting more street children than ever before. What are you doing with that money we're giving to Ndugu Society?" Now, for me, that was a very, very frustrating comment because we were working our butts off trying to address the question of urban poverty. Nobody seemed to recognize that. So what we did is we coined a project which was intended to address that directly. And we put together this program where we were telling the members of the public, listen, the next time you're confronted by a street child, don't give them a shilling because that won't help them very much. Instead, go to the nearest branch of this bank and there you'll buy a voucher. Buy a voucher for 5 shillings. If you give that child that voucher, tell him that if he takes that voucher to one of the places that are listed on the back of that voucher, he will be given food and he'll get a chance to have a shower. And then from there, I said, we have designed a program where our social worker will meet with that child and we will try and address their problem from there on.
Okay.
You know, that was a program that I was very, very proud of by the time I was leaving Ndugu Society because it created that linkage.
Yes.
And it gave our social workers who had been spending time on the streets anyway, gave them direct contact with the kids.
Yes.
And began to ask the question, where are the roots of our urban poverty? What is it that causes it?
And it also created a link with the person, the person who's encountering the street child.
It is there. Yeah. It is there, for instance, it's from there that we realized that these children, that the way to deal with these children is to reintegrate them back into the society, not to create orphanages and stuff like that.
And there's now, I think, President Uhuru, former President Uhuru actually put a directive and they're actually looking to phase out orphanages now.
Yeah. See, but those kinds of lessons now, it is going through that whole PBO process that we realized that, we were feeding some of that learning into the whole mix, so that when you get to the PBO Act that actually reads like you like it, what happened though is, as soon as Kenyatta and Ruto came into power, they too realized that they needed to legislate to control the NGO sector, and they had looked at the NGO Coordination Act and the PBO Act, which had been, they wanted to amend it as well. Yes. So that had, again, the NGO sector had learned to defend it, So those changes have happened sometimes without people knowing the history enough to actually appreciate what the philosophy is that informed it were in the first place. Yeah.
And I remember, I think one of the things that was really interesting was even just the rules of engagement between civil society and government.
Yeah.
And those were outlined in the legislation. And at the time it was quite a progressive legislation.
Yeah.
It still is because it's what it is, outlining what are the sectors, what does a public benefit organization look like, and what are the kind of sectors that it works in. I remember, I think I came right after when the bill was already being drafted, but it was interesting that there was actually philosophy even as to the contribution of the sector into the economy.
Exactly.
And we tried doing a study.
The campaigns to get this stuff enacted involved a fair amount of research as well. We had to be able to quantify what our contribution as NGOs to the economy was before, because how else do you talk to these political leaders who really don't give a damn? They just say, squash them, get them out of the way, that kind of thing. You see, so we had to say, we are not nobody. You need to pay attention to us. Yeah. So that was all part of what it has taken to get to this point. Where the NGO sector is now, I don't know. It's it's a tough story.
It is a tough story. But I wonder, we always talked about constructive irrelevance, right? Working ourselves out of a job.
Exactly.
but it seems that we are not really working ourselves out of a job.
No.
In fact, we're looking for more jobs.
We end up, I guess, you see, now I think for me, notions like active citizenship come into play. And I think we are at that point now where we are starting to say to ourselves, maybe we have to count on Gen Z to get us out of the rut we're in. And it is Gen Z. When you see, when Gen Z did what they did, the fact that they then unearthed a whole lot of information about all the things that are happening, and that they could start, they could contradict what somebody has said. When you talk about corruption, they could say, we know that this and this has happened. We know that so much has so much money and all. I think begins to show that if they were actively involved or engaged, if they continue to do their research, this country could be changed.
And it was so for me, what was fascinating is even the tools that they were using. So they were using artificial intelligence.
Absolutely.
And, there's a ChatGPT for, finding out whether your MP or your leader is corrupt or not. I mean, just the rules of engagement were so different.
Yeah. For me, that's what's going to totally change the dynamics and change the country. I think, I don't know how it's going to happen, but I think Gen Z have brought a totally different dynamic to this country's evolution.
And how do you see that with the recent, I guess, funding direction with the USAID
I think I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful because, you see, with AI and what Gen Z knows now, before you even start thinking about external funding and all, you think about what are you doing with what you have.
Exactly.
You see, and when they, I was listening to a podcast just last night where Winnie Byanyima was speaking to the question of Kizza Besigye's, trials and all of that. And she was saying, if you ask me what I'd like to see happening in Uganda right now, I would say that I don't retain any hope that Museveni can change. But I do know that if I had the power to begin with, I would basically change the rules totally. I'd change the economy, and I wouldn't, for instance, be paying MPs the tons of money that they're paid right now. I'd probably pay them a small fraction of that and tell them, manage as best you can. And she says, and this country would change in no time, because we basically have learned to basically, to misuse, abuse, and really, not to abuse what we have, So thinking along the same lines, if you look at a thing like the campaign that this guy, Boniface Mwangi, mounted for Starehe, when he was saying that one of his principal interests was to reduce the salaries of MPs, stuff like that. Nobody talks like that. But it will be necessary to look at how do you allocate your resources.
Absolutely.
And what do you do? What are the priorities? Look at where we are right now in terms of health and education. Look at what's happening. When you see what's happening and what it takes to turn that around, then you realize that it's the corruption that's destroying us. So how do you change that? An active citizenship, I think, will change it.
Yeah. And actually, that's a game changer, because then it redefines what civil society is.
Exactly.
Because civil society was being seen as NGOs or not for profit, but what the June 25th, movement and the young generation going to the streets did was that it was so funny, because it actually caught the NGOs by
Absolutely.
surprise.
Caught everybody unawares.
But caught everyone unawares.
No, I concur totally with Willy Mutunga. He put a tweet in saying the Gen Zs have breathed new life into this country by doing what they did. And I think that we need to follow from with ideas from that kind of experience and see, okay, how do you then continue or even stimulate some more active citizenship and change the damn country.
So, I went for this philanthropy conference, and there was this, crowdsourcing platform that was there, and they was sharing data, and, those millions of Kenya shillings that were raised during that period, Kenyans contributing towards the movement,
amazing.
like millions of Kenya shillings were raised during that period for protests.
Absolutely,
which is something that was unimaginable just a year, even 6 months before that.
No, it is amazing. It is amazing. I watched. I was listening to quite a few of these Spaces platforms, and I listened to one on one day where they said that I think the mother of one of those kids was killed, was in a really distraught state, and the guy said, "We need to raise, even if it's just 3 million." And give her so that she can bury her child. So he says, the number, we're using this number, give what you can, whatever it is, and let's at least enable her to bury her child. He says, we'd like to give it by 3:00. Do you know at 2:30 he then gave a progress report and said, we've raised 2.5 million.
Wow.
Yeah. It's impressive.
And it was even just how they were looking at accountability.
Exactly.
And they were saying that we're going to account for all every shilling that is raised. I mean, it was...
That's why for me, I think, Gen Z sort of came in to make a difference. And they have, they just demonstrate that you can make a difference. It's a question of, where do we go after this?
And I really like that you've brought that in, because I have been in spaces and I haven't been hearing that example of how development can look like,
exactly.
or how changing the face of development can look like in a country. And that's such a poignant point, right? That
Absolutely.
it could shift from this, structured kind of space into.
So in a sense, USAID getting out of the way is not such a bad thing after all, because, Trump will only be there for 4 years. I think the Americans will want to have, and not just the Americans, America itself will want to have other relationships. And it'll be a question of, okay, on what terms?
Yes.
And I think that, Trump he won't carry on the way he's carrying on for much longer. He's talking about taking Ukraine's rare earth minerals now. But how long can he carry on like this? So that's the other thing about, part of what's been lost now in the NGO sector. You talked about working ourselves out of a job, but there's even, there were things like Pan-Africanism, which we've totally lost. Now there's a lot of those things, those values and those principles that we need to rediscover.
And it's so interesting. The other day, there's a LinkedIn post and someone was talking about why isn't there an Africa need or a Kenya need?
I know.
Right? And it was like, for me, it was like such a simple but poignant point, right? Kenya, like Africans, that point on Pan-Africanism,
exactly.
Africans from across coming together in solidarity to support a country that's in distress in Africa.
Look at Sudan. Look at what's been happening now. But there's other countries. Sudan is one. Zimbabwe. If you knew the trouble Zimbabwe is in now, it's amazing. There's so much that, so much need that's exposing itself. It's a question of, okay, what's going to happen? How are you going to develop all these how are you going to respond to all these different needs? And how do you insert humanity back into play? So there's a lot to be done.
And it's actually solidarity, because that's how
Yes.
aid started, right?
Absolutely.
It was global solidarity.
Absolutely, yeah.
And now it's like these thoughts of, okay, now that, the Western forces are moving out of the way and they're looking more inward, that actually now Africa is in a different space.
Yeah.
And how can then Africa look inward? Because that's how Europe reconstructed by, just
now
looking
if you look
inward.
at it, you look at countries like India. India is very quickly growing into a world power. I mean, they've got a population, they've got 1.4 billion.
Yeah.
China is doing the same, and China is very insular. It basically focused on itself. But these things, geopolitics, I think, are changing things dramatically.
They are.
So we're in for maybe for a bumpy ride.
We are, but also for a time to reflect and to think about, to also be insular, because I think we've turned our eyes to the West a lot, and it's time to also look at ourselves.
Yeah. Now we're having to think about whether we look east or west.
East or west is also looking in, right?
Yes,
and seeing what do we have here, and how do we make best what you've just said about the resources that we actually have, and the whole point of active citizenship. Thank you, Ezra. This has been amazing. I could keep listening to you. We could
go on a bit.
Go on and on and on.
Yeah.
But, I hope that we'll have you again on the podcast and explore other areas of development. But I want to thank you so much, because it's always such an honor and a pleasure.
It was nice.
Yeah.
Good to talk.
Thank you.